The bevel mitre is a very useful joint in woodwork, and especially if you're building hip roofs or boats or bar stools, for example. And a bevel mitre is where the wood angles in two directions simultaneously, and you achieve that by angling both your saw blade and holding the wood on the angle against the mitre gauge. I've got my mitre gauge set at the correct angle and locked in the slot, and I've got this parallel-sided piece of MDF up against the upstand of the mitre gauge and G-clamped the table. You'll see what that's for in a moment. Whenever you're doing bevel cuts, you need to raise the saw blade up out of the slot in the table and then loosen the knob and adjust to the correct angle that you want before locking it firmly at that position. Then put your saw in and make your saw blade teeth walk over the sacrificial board and then lock it at that position. Now, whenever you're bevel cutting, your saw blade rises up out of the slot in the table and moves sideways. So you must never raise your table when doing a bevel cut. Always do the bevel cut on a sacrificial board of the appropriate thickness. Now I can rest my piece of wood against this board, hold it firmly, gripping it to the upstand. Make sure you haven't used too much packing and that to overly reduce the height of mitre gauge upstand that you can hold against, but this is fine. Grip the work very firmly and gently do the cut. And there we have a bevel mitre, which is perfect for compound joints. Now you might notice that that first cut that I did has left a groove, a shallow groove in the sacrificial board. And that's perfect, provided I don't adjust that G-clamp. That groove shows me exactly where my saw blade is going to pass each time, so I can put a pencil mark on my piece of wood just there, line it up with the groove and make my cut exactly to the line. If you're doing bevel cuts which are square to the piece of wood, then instead of using the protractor to support the wood, you should use a cross-cut fence. And again, as with the bevel mitre, you need to have a sacrificial packer up on your table. Now this particular saw at 45 degrees requires 22 mil of packing, which I've achieved with a piece of plywood and a piece of MDF. This little cleat, this shallow cleat glued and screwed underneath is very important. There is another one on this side of the platform, and together they make sure the platform stays in exactly the same spot. It can only slide forwards and backwards, not sideways, and so that every time you refit this platform, it's in exactly the same spot. Because the very first cut that you make will give you a groove, a shallow groove through here, and a 45-degree notch through there. Now you can use them both effectively as your sighting marks for sighting up future cuts. Just before you make that first cut, it's a good idea to check that your saw is set exactly at 45 degrees. So I've got this piece of parallel-sided scrap. I'll just put it in there and then take a free cutting piece of material. This piece of MDF is ideal, and the scrap will just stop my saw before I actually get to the MDF subfence. So hold it firmly, safety glasses, and away we go. Didn't quite push it far enough, but you can see the idea. Now I get these two pieces, put them together and put my square on them to make sure that I was set exactly at 45 degrees, because that should then give me a right angle. I'd make any adjustments necessary, and if I'm happy with the position, then I can clear my table and then go through and make my cut. You get a pretty generous width of cut in the cross-cut mode, in the bevel saw mode, 400 to 450 millimeters. You must never attempt to do a bevel plunge cut because a saw blade in plunging will push the wood sideways. So you're restricted to the normal cut of your power saw on the Workcentre. If the bevel cut is longer than 400, 450 mil, you might want to consider doing it in a table saw mode. But given that limitation, you've still got plenty of room to put in multiple pieces of wood. That's a great feature of the Workcentre, because if you're cutting a frame, be it a square frame or a rectangular frame, you're probably cutting 2 or 4 pieces to exactly the same length on the bevel. Measuring and marking them individually is a bit of a pain, and cutting exactly at the same side of the line each time is even more difficult. So what you do is just line up the ends, put the wood in, make sure these ends are just over the little channel that you've got in the sacrificial board, and hold the wood very, very firmly, because there is a tendency for the wood to want to creep this way during the cut, pushed that way by the saw. You must also push the saw very gently, don't force it to cut. And if you've got a wobbly saw, then we suggest that you either fit the Triton saw stabilizer bracket or do these sort of cuts with the trigger locked on and pushing the saw by the back of the slide chassis, because you will tend to unconsciously twist the saw a little bit as you're going through. Having said all that, let's do the cut. Now, by lining up these outside ends perfectly, I can then hold the pieces again and do my second cut, and these 2 pieces will be exactly the same length. And that's both easier and more accurate than trying to measure, mark and cut them all individually. And it could have been 4 pieces, although with 4 pieces I would have taped them together. Bevel cutting does put a lot of load on your power saw and your blade, and if you're cutting some hardwood, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some ridging, burn marks or high spots in the cut. They're quite easily fixed. Allow for them in making your first cuts so that your pieces are slightly oversized. Then after cutting them at 45 degrees, creep them very slightly over the edge of the slot in your MDF, either the table or the MDF subfences, and then do a finishing cut where you're taking off only half or 1 millimetre of wood rather than 2.5 millimetres of wood, and any tendency for a problem is therefore much reduced. The bevel joint, while very attractive, isn't terribly strong, and it can open up quite easily unless you've put some nails or screws through there, which you don't want to do in a nice piece of furniture. You'll see shortly how to join bevels like this with the biscuit joiner very tightly and accurately, but if you don't have a router to use a biscuit joiner, there is a way with your saw. The splined bevel joint is a very useful joint in woodwork, very attractive and very strong. Now, as you can see from these 2 examples, while you could aim for the middle of the joint to put your spline or your key, you can see from this one, a shorter spline can go closer to the outside edge of the bevel, whereas a longer spline here is closer to the inside edge of the bevel where there's a bit more material to hang on to. The way to cut your spline grooves is to put your bevel cut pieces back into the Workcentre, this time from the left-hand side. It is a very good idea to cut them 2 or 4 at a time, taped or clamped together, and you can mark on the bevel where exactly you want the spline groove to go, and match up the pencil mark with the notch in your MDF subfences. Now, it is very important that you raise your saw blade a little out of the table, up off the sacrificial board, otherwise you'll neatly cut your bevels right off, and you don't want that to happen. Now, hand access is a little bit of a problem here, so keep your hand down nice and flat, keep pushing firmly, or you may even want to clamp these pieces down to the sacrificial board, but I'll just hand hold them and I should be right. And then, because I cut these 2 pieces at the same time, the 2 grooves must line up perfectly. Plywood is the best material to use for your keys because it's strong in all directions. If you do want a contrasting piece of wood in there, you can rip yourself a thin strip in the table saw mode, but make sure it's material that's not going to split easily at that point if undue load is put on the joint.